How precious is freedom to you? And what lengths would you go to in order to preserve that freedom? I'm your host, Leah.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Steve. Today's episode is about a man who put everything on the line to gain freedom for himself, his family, and his crew. Join us as we tell you the story of Civil War hero Robert SMALLS.
If you have an appetite for the strange and bizarre, then pull up a chair and grab a spoon for another intriguing serving of Remnant Stew. Remnant Stew is gluten-free, organic, made from all natural, free-range ingredients, and guaranteed to provide the recommended daily serving of curiosity.
Well, you know, as a person who has taught history for many years, I'm very aware of the current discussion concerning what gets taught to our students. People across the spectrum have different ideas about what we should teach our children, particularly when it comes to United States history. State boards of education across the country are grappling with this issue continually. There are those people who appear to want to focus primarily on the bad things that this country has done. They seem to feel that this nation's mistakes have often been swept under the rug, and that populations who have historically suffered are minimalized in the retelling of our national story. On the other hand, there are those people who only want to focus on the good things that this nation has done. They want our history to be told as a continuing list of great accomplishments. In my opinion, the problem with both of these approaches, focusing on only the bad or only the good, is that neither one gives a complete picture of the truth.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
For example, our nation during World War II did an astonishing job of mobilizing people and materials for the war effort. As men were called into the military, millions of women stepped up and did the hard work in the factories, building planes, tanks, ships, and weapons of war. I've talked a number of times about my little mother-in-law who worked at a plant making ball bearings for the Navy. Countless stories can be told of the courage of brave soldiers storming the beaches of Sicily, Anzio, Normandy, Iwo Jima, and dozens of other places that most Americans had never heard of. There is much to be proud of. However, at the same time, American citizens of Japanese descent were denied their lawful rights. Many lost their homes and businesses as their families were forced to relocate to isolation camps. The military itself was still segregated up until the end of World War II. Numerous accounts were noted of African American soldiers who had served courageously in Europe and the Pacific being lynched while still in uniform upon stepping off the bus when arriving back home in the southern states. So you see, the whole truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always important for our understanding of our past.
Yes.
Now, I bring all this up today because today's episode does contain some of those uncomfortable truths from our nation's history, but it is also a story of bravery and courage and admirable strength. We're going to learn about a very remarkable man named Robert SMALLS. Now, even though I had taught history for many years, I had never heard of this man up until a couple of months ago when my wife and I took a brief trip to a place that I had always wanted to visit, Charleston, South Carolina. We've done a few stories about Charleston. Remember the mermaid riot?
Yeah. That's one of my favorite stories.
Right.
We've done a lot on Charleston, actually.
It is a really beautiful and a very historic city. It's one of the oldest cities in the United States, going all the way back to 1670. As I've mentioned before, one of my favorite things to do in a new city is to get a walking tour hosted by a local. There was a website called walksofcharleston.com. Highly recommend it. We met a local guide named Dennis Martis, and I would call Dennis the king of tour guides. He was amazing. He gave us the most remarkable tour through the oldest part of the city. Now, I was curious if the people of Charleston had tried to gloss over some of the more uncomfortable parts of their history. It was the port of entry for nearly 40% of all slaves entering the United States. But as Dennis led us through the tour, he made it clear that slavery was completely enmeshed with the fabric of the city's history, sometimes literally. Many of the city's streets and buildings are constructed of red bricks, which were actually made by slave women and children. In fact, in several locations, you can still see the handprints of slave children embedded in the bricks.
Oh,
it's
wow.
really almost haunting to see in a way. There's really no glossing over it. In addition to touring historic buildings, churches, and cemeteries, Dennis led us to a table where several African-American women were selling handmade baskets beautifully designed with patterns that had been passed down to them from their African ancestors. I got the real sense that Charleston was trying hard not to hide, but to accept and make peace with its difficult past. Near the end of the tour, Dennis led us to the waterfront, and he pointed out the various sites in the harbor, including Fort Sumter, which saw the first shots of the Civil War. It's on an island about 4 miles out into the harbor. Next to the tree by the water, Dennis pointed to a plaque that briefly told the story of Robert SMALLS. It was such an intriguing story that I felt compelled to investigate it further. And after our tour with Dennis, we visited the Slave Mart Museum, which was located in the building where slaves had been auctioned. I located in the gift shop a book called Be Free or Die, which detailed the fascinating story of Robert SMALLS. This book was written by a very talented young author named Kate Lineberry, and Kate is C-A-T-E, Kate Lineberry. And we are very grateful here at Remnant Stew to Ms. Lineberry for granting us permission to quote directly from this excellent book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the story you're going to hear is largely quoted directly from her book. Here now is the extraordinary story of Robert SMALLS.
Robert SMALLS was born on April 5, 1839, in the town of Beaufort, South Carolina. His mother, 43-year-old Lydia Polite, gave birth to him alone in her sparse slave quarters. Her living quarters were behind an elegant white frame house that was shaded by live oaks with moss hanging down like holiday tinsel. We have a lot of that Spanish oak around here.
Right.
Or Spanish moss, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Spanish moss.
Spanish moss. This peaceful setting gave no clue to the anguished lives of the people forced to work there as slaves. As Lydia brought her son into the world, she knew that he, too, would live a life entirely dictated by someone else.
Right.
At the time Robert SMALLS was born, Beaufort was the largest town on the coast between Charleston and Savannah. It was a wealthy town that boasted several schools, a college, a jail, a large library, and several churches. Steamboats announced their arrival with high-pitched whistles, bringing in supplies, mail, and visitors, as well as hauling out vast quantities of cotton, indigo, which is a blue dye,
right,
and rice.
Yeah, a lot of rice, I think. Yeah.
Beaufort also possessed a heavily stocked arsenal and a regular slave patrol that was dedicated to protecting the white population in case of a slave revolt. White townspeople feared a slave rebellion as much as, if not more, than any fire or plague. One reason for this fear was that the slave population outnumbered the white by a ratio of at least 10 to 1.
Yeah.
One year-round resident of the town was a 27-year-old man named Henry McKee. He owned the elegant white-framed house on Prince Street and its slave quarters where Robert SMALLS was born. McKee also owned Lydia, who served as his house slave. Although McKee was a relatively kind master, he was nonetheless a master who had to be obeyed, even though Lydia had helped to raise him.
That's right. She actually was his nurse as he was growing up, and then he ended up being her master once his father died.
Right. As Lydia's baby, Robert also became McKee's property, just as all enslaved children belonged to their mother's owner. Along with his vast plantations, McKee had inherited Lydia and some 60 other slaves when his father passed away. Now, as house slaves, Lydia and Robert enjoyed privileges that were denied to other slaves. They had some freedom of movement and were allowed to till a small patch of ground to raise food to eat or sell. But the future was always uncertain. It was very common for slave families to be split up, as masters often sold some family members to other slaveholders. Lydia wanted Robert to be aware of this. One Saturday, she took him to see a slave auction in the town square. Women wailed uncontrollably as their husbands or sons were sold. On another occasion, Lydia took Robert to the Beaufort jail to see a slave being whipped. Despite the horror of it, she wanted her young son to understand the lives filled with pain and suffering that most enslaved people endured. As Robert grew, he showed a keen intellect, and you'll see this throughout the entire story. He was very intelligent.
Right.
Though it was illegal for slaves to receive an education, McKee gave Robert the opportunity to learn skills that could enhance his ability to be a valuable asset to him or any future owner, and also gave Robert better opportunities within the slave hierarchy. He was smart, capable, and well-liked by the McKee family.
Right. We're very well liked by the family. Other family members wrote later on about how how much the family liked him. Well, in 1851, Robert was about 12. For reasons that are not entirely known, McKee sent Robert Smalls to work in Charleston. The money Robert earned would go to McKee except for $1 per month, which he let Robert keep. When Robert arrived in Charleston, he encountered a bustling port city that liked to flaunt its wealth and aristocratic traditions. From waterfront mansions to Georgian townhouses, the homes of Charleston's wealthy reflected their owners and the fortunes many had made from the sweat of enslaved people. Importing slaves from Africa had become illegal since 1808, but the buying and selling of enslaved people already in the country remained a brisk business. Naked men, women, and children were sold in open slave markets as potential buyers evaluated them as if they were livestock. Sellers would fatten up and even grease the skin of slaves to make them appear healthier. Robert Smalls stayed in slave quarters at the home of Henry McKee's sister-in-law, Eliza Ancrum, but he did not work here. Instead, he found work as a waiter at the Planters Hotel. The Ancrum slaves likely informed Robert of the unique rules of being a slave in Charleston. At 8:50 p.m. each evening, a drummer would stand outside each of the city's police stations and drum out a 10-minute warning. All slaves had to be off the street by the time the church bells struck 9 p.m. In addition, any slave who held a job in the city had to wear a metal tag stating their name and the place where they were employed. Anyone who violated these rules was arrested and sent to a notorious place known as the workhouse, where severely cruel punishments were issued.
Wow.
After working as a waiter for a while, Robert took a job as a lamplighter. In 1846, the Charleston Gas Light Company had installed gas lights in glass globes, say that really fast a few times, gas lights in glass globes, to light the city's streets. Many of these same gas lights still exist today. It was really stunning to walk around the city and see actual gas lights still burning there.
Oh, I love gas lights.
Yeah, really. They weren't like facsimiles. They were the real thing. Robert's job was to clean the globes and remove soot from the jets in the morning and then light the lamps in the evening. Now, this job gave him a good deal of independence. By the time Robert was a teenager, Charleston's waterfront was calling him. With McKee's permission, Robert began working as a stevedore, loading and unloading cargo from the various ships. The docks teemed with a mixture of free blacks, enslaved blacks, and Irish immigrants, exposing Robert to new people, ideas, and opportunities. He secured a new job driving the hoisting horses that helped to load and unload the vessels. I think the cranes were horse-driven, basically, a system of pulleys.
Powered that way.
That the horses would be marched back and forth that would lift and lower things to and from the ships.
Well, just think about this at this time. He's already jumped, 4 jobs?
Right, yes.
In a few years, but he's gathering those skills and meeting all those different people and getting all of those ideas already up into, this is his teenage years, right?
Right.
Yeah, he's actually in his early teens here, right? Yep. His employer was a white man named John Simmons. Simmons clearly valued Robert's work ethic and was fond of him. Simmons taught Robert how to make rope lines and sails, and eventually hired him as a sailor on a local schooner. With these new positions came higher pay, most of which went to McKee, but he increased the amount that Robert could keep each month.
But by the time he reached 17, Robert felt flush enough to take on a wife. He married Hannah Jones, an enslaved woman in her 30s. Hannah's master hired her out to be a washerwoman and a maid. Robert later said, quote, "My idea was to have a wife to prevent me from running around."
Smart.
Slaves could not legally marry, but owners could grant permissions for unofficial service, and doing so was often in their best interest. So granting permission to marry helped the morale of the slaves, but it also eventually added to their wealth, since any children of the enslaved women became the master's property.
Yeah, wealth of the owner.
Yeah.
Right?
Male slaves with families were also less likely to run away. The ceremony took place at Christmas in 1856 at Henry McKee's home in Beaufort and was attended by Robert's mother, Lydia, who was still owned by the McKee family. She remained a central figure in Robert's life. After the wedding, Robert and Hannah returned to Charleston and tried to build a life together despite their lack of freedom. After 2 years, their first daughter, Elizabeth Lydia, was born. With the birth of his daughter, 19-year-old Robert Smalls grew more concerned that his family might be separated, which is a really true, real fear that these slaves had.
It happened all the time, I think.
He became desperate for a way to protect them. He boldly approached Hannah's owner and asked him if he would sell Hannah and Elizabeth to him. The owner agreed to sell them, but the price was high. It was $800. It was difficult but not impossible for slaves in Charleston to accumulate money. Hannah took to washing sailors' shirts, and Robert took on extra work when he could find it. Slowly their savings began to grow, but it would still likely take several years to save $800. And even if they did, Robert himself would still be enslaved to Henry McKee. Still, he wanted to do whatever he could to protect his wife and children. More and more, he began to entertain the idea of escaping with his family.
In April of 1860, the National Democratic Convention met in Charleston for the purpose of selecting their candidate for president. There was a good deal of excitement as delegates gathered. However, the excitement quickly turned to tension over an argument about the expansion of slavery to new states out west. The party quickly divided into northern and southern factions. The Southerners wanted a plank in the party platform that stated continued support for the institution of slavery, but Northern delegates refused. This prompted the Southern delegates to walk out of the convention, leaving the remaining delegates unable to secure the two-thirds majority needed to select a nominee. In effect, the Democratic Party split over the issue of slavery. Northern Democrats reconvened in Baltimore and selected Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas as their nominee. Yes, that's Stephen Douglas from the Lincoln-Douglas debates 2 years before. Radical pro-slavery Democrats met in Richmond, Virginia, and selected John Breckinridge. The brand new Republican Party met in Chicago and nominated Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. But wait, there was one more. The Union Party, which argued for compromise to keep the nation together, met in Baltimore and nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Bell was a slave owner, but was against expanding slavery into the West. Americans were so divided over slavery that they had 4 presidential candidates. Wow. At the time, in 1860, 152 electoral votes were needed to win the presidential election. With so many candidates splitting the vote, Lincoln won with 180 electoral votes and about 40% of the popular vote. A very divided country for sure. South Carolinians were furious at the result, believing that Lincoln was hostile to slavery and a threat to their way of life. Almost immediately, an outbreak of secession fever hit the state, and 6 weeks after the election, Charleston hosted the state's secession convention, where delegates voted unanimously to leave the Union. White Charlestonians erupted in celebration at the news. Leah and Phil, I've met a lot of folks who've tried to make the argument that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. I find that pretty hard to support, that argument, seeing as how the slavery issue caused the Democratic Party to split, which then led to Lincoln's election, which then led to South Carolina's seceding. So it seemed like,
and that was just the beginning of it, right? Because right after that, all the other southern states
fell in line
and did their own secession.
Right.
I mean, it's the leading topic.
So it seems like it was pretty central to the event. Yeah. Slavery was, yes. Well, about 4 miles out from Charleston waterfront lies Fort Sumter. This coastal island defense fortification had been constructed soon after the War of 1812. Remember that war against the British, as a protection from foreign threats. Well, by the time Lincoln took office in March of 1861, the United States soldiers at Fort Sumter faced a different kind of threat, that being from the South Carolina militia. Union troops at Fort Sumter were in dire need of food and supplies, and the Confederacy's anger at the continued occupation of the fort was growing. As the situation escalated during the next month, Lincoln announced that he would send provisions to Fort Sumter, which infuriated the Confederacy.
Oh, yeah.
They ordered the federal troops to surrender, but the commander refused. Thus, on April 12th, 1861, Confederate forces fired the first shots of the Civil War on Fort Sumter. People in Charleston were able to see the attack from their homes. After 2 days of bombardment, the Union commander, Robert Anderson, agreed to withdraw his troops. On April 14, 1861, the United States flag was lowered, and the Union troops left Fort Sumter.
I'll never understand why anyone wants to be president of the United States, but I definitely don't understand why anyone at this time would have wanted to become president.
But
sitting on a powder keg.
You got voted into that powder keg because there was four people brought in, and they were divided on both sides.
Yeah, I can't imagine running.
So divided.
Knowing that the potential that's going to happen, high potential that will happen.
Yeah.
Back to Robert Smalls. He almost certainly watched the attack and many celebrations that erupted in Charleston's streets during the next few days. Seeing the Confederates rejoice at their victory may have strengthened his resolve to act. In February of 1861, Robert and Hannah had their second child, a boy named Robert Jr. The couple still had not earned enough money to buy Hannah and Elizabeth, much less another child.
Right.
Their owner now might likely raise the price in addition, with the addition of Robert Jr.
More than likely another $400.
Exactly. The couple continued to save as much as they could in the hopes of keeping the family together. That same year, a new opportunity for work presented itself. In June of 1861, Smalls was hired to be part of the crew of the Planter, a Confederate ship.
Oh, bum, bum, bum.
The next summer, the first major battles of the Civil War were not going well for the Union. The Confederate victory at the Battle of Bull Run was a wake-up call. Later that summer, Congress authorized the Confiscation Act, which allowed the Union to seize any slaves used to aid in the rebellion. It meant that slaves seized by the Union were no longer obligated to their former masters.
Right.
This was the first step towards emancipation.
Right. So if the Union if slaves escaped and got to the Union, they didn't have to return them. There used to be this thing they called the Fugitive Slave Act, that even if a slave went to the northern states, the law was that they were supposed to be returned to the South, although it didn't always happen, but that was still the law. Well, this did away with that provision.
And I think just really started that whole Underground Railroad.
Right. Oh, even more.
Yeah.
Well, it was already happening.
It was already happening.
Yeah.
But it
could speed up the process from getting.
By the fall of 1861, Smalls was a tested member of Planter's crew. The vessel's white officers had noted Smalls' skills on the water and had promoted him to wheelman. This allowed him to gain valuable experience, learning to steer the ship throughout the harbor. The Planter was engaged in transporting Confederate troops and weapons to the various defensive positions around Charleston. Smalls learned how to avoid sandbars, navigate the currents, and bring the ship safely into the docks. That November, the Union Navy made a successful invasion at Beaufort, South Carolina, Smalls' original hometown.
Yeah.
Union troops under Commander Francis DuPont destroyed 2 Confederate forts at Port Royal near Beaufort and then quickly secured the area. This was the first major Union naval victory of the war.
Yeah, they wanted a place to
drop troops,
run blockades from.
Right.
They needed a base to run blockades from. Yeah.
With the area in Union control, Beaufort's white citizens immediately fled the town and headed to Charleston. News of the Union victory quickly spread and was quite a shock to the residents of Charleston. One of the purposes of the Beaufort invasion was to give the Union a base from which to operate a naval blockade, like you said, of Charleston Harbor. Many Charleston residents braced themselves for a possible Union attack on the city. DuPont had not expected the white residents of the Beaufort area to flee and leave their 10,000 slaves behind.
Oh, wow.
Just run off and left them.
This left the Union forces with a dilemma of how to care for and protect the suddenly freed black population. They needed food, clothing, housing, and medical attention, but no plan was in place for providing these necessities. Since his arrival, DuPont had seen firsthand the toll slavery had taken on the former slaves. He had been raised in the border state of Delaware, but neither he nor his family owned slaves.
Yeah, this is the famous DuPont family of Delaware. He's part of that family, yeah.
Until he arrived in South Carolina, he'd been under the impression that enslaved people were treated humanely. His views quickly changed.
Yeah.
In a letter to his wife, DuPont wrote, quote, "My ideas have undergone great changes to the condition of the slaves since I came here and have been on the plantations. I have seen nothing that has disgusted me more than the wretched physical wants of these poor people, who earn all the gold spent by their masters in luxury. No wonder they risk being shot down rather than go back to their owners." Unquote.
Yeah, quite a eye-opening for him. And I think that was the way a lot of people thought, well, they're slaves, but yeah, they're being treated fairly.
Yeah,
it was being presented that way.
Right.
I mean, that's the other.
As
There's a lot of it. Yeah,
right.
it was just, hey, yeah, everything's going great with them. They're all fine.
Yeah,
Don't come check it out.
They're well taken care of. They're well cared for. Well, it wasn't often the case.
And now for something completely off topic and off kilter. Brace yourself for the oddity du jour.
Okay, so for today's oddity du jour, we got something just a little bit on a lighter topic.
All right.
I call it on the move, or moving on up. How about that?
Moving on up.
In 1907, the Central Union Telephone Company built a headquarters building on the corner of Meridian and New York Streets in Indiana. The company was bought out in 1929 by Indiana Bell Telephone Company, who felt that the old headquarters building was not big enough for their operations. So, a telephone company, it just grows bigger and bigger.
Yeah. More people getting phones in those days, yeah.
The idea was for them to build a bigger, more modern headquarters on that spot, but the problem was that in demolishing the old building to make way for a new building would take a great deal of time and cause a lengthy interruption in the telephone services. And that just wasn't going to do it.
Okay, folks, just do without your phone for the next 2 years. We're going to build a new building. Oh, it'll be great. You'll enjoy it. But for the next 2 years, no phone service.
Don't call anyone. Because they won't answer.
Don't have an emergency.
That just wasn't going to do it. The architect hired to design the new building, he came up with a really innovative plan. There was a vacant lot at 13 West New York Street adjacent to the current location, so why not move the old building over there, all while continuing business as usual?
Just pick it up.
And that's exactly what they did.
Pick the whole thing up.
The exact dates are a little sketchy because I got different dates from different sources, but over a 30 to 34 day period, the 11,000-ton, 8-story steel frame and brick building, it was lifted a quarter of an inch and shifted 52 feet to the south, then rotated 90 degrees, shifted again 100 feet to the west to its final location.
All while continuing phone service the entire time.
The entire time. Every 6 strokes of the jacks would shift the building 3/8 of an inch.
Wow.
It would move 15 inches an hour, the breakneck speed.
Dude,
right?
that was amazing. The hair would just wiggle.
8 floors. That's pretty amazing. Yeah.
And all the 600 workers within the building still report it to work every day.
So, like all those operators with the big heavy headsets, they're still in there pulling out things?
Yeah, they're still in there pulling out.
That just goes to say how much cable length was underneath or around to allow for that shifting in any direction.
That's right. The move was completed in November of 1930 without interrupting any of the customer telephone service or business operations. And the gas, heat, electric, water, and communication lines were all modified
as
before and during, it went. There is a stop motion video
of how this worked.
Of this.
I have no doubt that was just, at the time, that's like innovation craziness right there. And then the planning on how to do it, and then working with your teams to make sure you can execute that. Right. That's impressive.
That's right. It was amazing. The execution. And can you imagine sitting at your desk looking out the window and just your view changes every day.
every couple hours. So you move a 15.
Well, 15 inches. So they plopped that one down. They built a new 7-story headquarters building that was completed in 1932.
Shorter.
And shorter, but I think it just
more
was a whole lot more efficient.
Modern.
Yeah,
okay.
more modern, more efficient.
Modern. All right.
And operations were moved from the old building to there. The original building then was demolished in 1963. So it stayed around for a little while,
right.
but then. By the way, the architect that managed to plan and execute this amazing task before constructing the new building was Kurt Vonnegut Sr.
Oh,
his father to Kurt Vonnegut Jr., author of Slaughterhouse 5 and Cat's Cradle and many other writings.
Vonnegut, wow. Famous author. Interesting.
And I got my information from Wikipedia and openculture.com.
Just picked up the building, moved it across the street.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try to remember to put that on our Facebook.
The stop
YouTube,
motion?
Yeah, the YouTube video, because it is. Like this whole building just moves.
Yeah, I know they did that fairly recently down in, not far from the greater Cut & Sheet area down in San Antonio, Texas. They picked an old hotel up and moved it several blocks away, and I think down the street too.
And
pretty
I'm
amazing how they can
usually
do that.
right in the middle of the traffic. That's that's waiting for that building to cross the street. And we're back.
Yay!
Dun, dun, dun.
All right, well, let's go back to 1861 and South Carolina. And actually, now we're at the spring, the winter of 1861. The spring of 1862, the war was lumbering on, lasting much longer and taking a much greater toll in dead and wounded than anyone on either side had ever anticipated. In fact, just in April, the two-day Battle of Shiloh left 3,600 dead and more than 17,000 wounded. I think we mentioned in one of their other episodes, that was more dead than in all the wars combined up until that day.
That's right.
For the United States, anyway.
Yeah, both sides are thinking that the other one would just walk over everybody.
Right.
And take over on either end.
Yeah.
And it just proved completely the opposite.
Yeah, just drug on. Well, meanwhile, Robert SMALLS was continuing to gain experience piloting the Planter around the harbor. He was also working on an escape plan. The Planter had a 10-man crew. 3 white officers oversaw 7 enslaved crew members. The captain was a stocky man named Charles Relya, R-E-L-Y-E-A, who enjoyed wearing large straw Panama hats while on board. While regulations stated that at least one officer had to always remain on ship, SMALLS noticed that from time to time, all 3 officers would leave the ship at night in order to spend time with their wives and families. He had overheard them saying that they had no worries about the crewmen because enslaved blacks were certainly not capable of operating the ship on their own.
Except they were totally running the ship.
Right.
One night, when the officers were away, one of the crew members jokingly took the captain's large Panama hat and placed it on SMALLS' head. "You look just like Captain Relya," they joked. Well, this seemingly inconsequential moment sparked an idea. Wearing the captain's hat just might deceive the harbor guards if it were done in the dark.
Dun, dun, here's an idea.
SMALLS began working on his plan in earnest. He and the other enslaved crew members would need to take the Planter away from the dock on a moonless night. Hannah, Elizabeth, Robert Jr., and some of the other men's wives and children would need to hide at a location up the Ashley River. The Planter would steam up the river to pick them up at the secret location, then ply back downstream toward the harbor. Everything would have to look like the ship was just on its normal routine. The women and children would have to go below deck and remain very quiet. Now, you got little bitty children now. You still got to remain very quiet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Then the Planter would steam out of the harbor and toward Fort Sumter. Upon passing the fort, it would give the impression that it was going to dock at Morris Island, which was another Confederate post, but instead it would shoot past Morris Island and out into the open ocean, hopefully before the sentries on duty took notice and alerted the artillery. Once in the ocean, the men would raise a white flag over the ship and attempt to locate one of the Union ships that were blockading the harbor. Simple plan, right?
That's totally simple.
Actually, there were about 1,000 things that could go wrong.
Yeah.
One cry of a baby in the middle of in a good evening, it's over.
Exactly. When Robert SMALLS told his wife Hannah about the idea, she wanted to know what would happen if he were caught. He didn't hold back the truth. Quote, "All of the men will be shot to death, and all the women and children will face severe punishment." Hannah thought for a moment and then told her husband, quote, "It is a risk, dear, but you and I and our little ones must be free. I will go, for where you die, I will die." Both were willing to do whatever it took to win their children's freedom. Next, SMALLS had to approach his fellow crew members. In fact, just sharing this plan with them was in itself a huge risk.
Right.
Yeah, because
Even talking about escape was incredibly dangerous in Confederate Charleston. If someone accidentally revealed the plan, the whole group would pay a huge price. But SMALLS could not operate the ship on his own. His only option was to recruit the men and trust them. He met with the crew in secret one night in late April or early May of 1862. Each knew the risk that they would be taking. The promise of freedom was so strong, and the thought of remaining in slavery so abhorrent, that all of the crew agreed to take part in the escape. They had to be ready to act whenever SMALLS decided it was time.
Yeah, that is so dangerous. It's so dangerous.
It just takes any one of them, not just the members of the crew and the family, and any of the children saying something in passing by and someone overhearing it.
Right.
Or just one of the crew being too scared to do this.
Right. Chickening, chickening out or changing their mind because it's just over.
Well, and they either were all in or not going to do it at all because you couldn't, there was no, well, he doesn't want to do it so he can stay home.
Right.
He didn't have an option of staying home.
Yeah, he had to be on the ship regardless. Yeah.
Well, on the afternoon of May 12th, 1862, the planter was ordered to steam to Coal Island in Charleston Harbor to pick up 4 cannons and several other large guns. The following day, they were to deliver them to Fort Ripley, which was under construction on another island in the harbor. With the cannons on board, Smalls decided that the time was right to seize the vessel. Not only would he be delivering a valuable Confederate ship to the Union, but also several desperately needed pieces of artillery. Smalls also noticed that the Confederate guard boat that monitored the entrance to the harbor was missing. He asked the captain where the guard boat was and was told that it had been sent for repairs. So the time is right.
Oh, wow.
Smalls quietly let the crew know that it would be time to make their attempt that night.
Mm.
Can you imagine going about your business and not letting on? Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting goosebumps. As nightfall arrived, one of the 3 officers suddenly announced that he was going to stay on board the steamer that night rather than go to his home as he had originally announced. Smalls and the rest of the crew just went about their normal business as usual, but secretly they had planned to lock the man into the stateroom or in his stateroom or kill him if necessary.
Oh, wow.
Fortunately, the man changed his mind again and went ashore. Time passed slowly through the night as they wondered what the next few hours would bring. They could not leave the wharf too early, or they might raise questions about why they were out on the water in the dark. If they left too close to dawn, someone on shore might discover that no white officers were on board. Finally, around 3 a.m., the crew began preparations for leaving. They added wood to the fires and anxiously waited for the water in the boilers to heat. They would get underway as soon as they had enough steam. An unfortunate shift in the wind began blowing the smoke from their fires back toward the city. Charleston had suffered a terrible fire just 5 months before, and people were always on edge.
Yeah.
Later, Smalls wrote, quote, "I feared that people would think there was a fire near the wharf," unquote. The minutes ticked by, and the men braced themselves for disaster. But no suspicious guards or curious citizens appeared. Relieved, they continued their preparations to depart. When Smalls judged that the time was right, he ordered the steamer to leave. The crew raised 2 flags, the stars and bars of the Confederacy and the blue and white South Carolina state flag, which displayed the palmetto tree and a crescent. Both would give the appearance of business as usual. A guard stationed nearby and a police officer both saw the ship leaving, but assumed that the vessel's officers were in command. The ship soon reached the wharf where Hannah and the others were hidden. Quote, "The planter moved so slowly up to her place we did not have to throw a plank or tie a rope," Smalls later said. All had gone as planned, and they were now together. With 16 people on board and the women and children below decks, the planter resumed her way back down river toward Charleston Harbor. Each rotation of the paddle wheels brought the group closer to realizing their dreams, but they could not go too fast.
Yep, had to maintain that order.
Smalls kept a normal, steady pace to maintain the impression that the ship was just going about its regular business. After about 2 miles, the planter passed Fort Johnson. As they passed the well-armed fort, the crew scanned the batteries for any sign that their plan had been discovered. After a harrowing few minutes, they passed it without arousing any suspicions and continued east, toward Fort Sumter and the main ship channel. Their early success must have helped settle their nerves, but their biggest challenges were still ahead.
Yep.
Yeah. Heading toward Fort Sumter, Smalls rang the engine room for more steam. This far out on the harbor, they could increase their speed without attracting any notice. However, the men in the engine room took this as a sign that something had gone wrong. One of them later wrote, "When the call, quote, when the call came for a full head of steam, I was scared, and so was the other man. We were both as scared as rabbits in front of a dog. And it was the same for everyone else on board, too, except for Robert Smalls. If he ever lost his nerve for a single minute, no one ever noticed it." As the planter picked up speed and steamed toward Fort Sumter, it passed several more boats. The first was a gunboat at anchor. Despite the potential danger, Small remained calm and simply saluted the gunboat with a whistle. Donning the captain's huge Panama hat, Smalls continued playing his part and occasionally shouted greetings to the other ships in the pre-dawn darkness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Around 4:15 a.m., the planter finally neared the formidable Fort Sumter, whose massive walls towered some 50 feet above the water. Fort Sumter overlooks the main ship channel entering Charleston Harbor. To restrict access, the Confederates had constructed a floating log boom all the way across the channel, but left a narrow gap near the fort to allow blockade runners to slip through. Any vessel entering this gap had to pass directly under Fort Sumter's powerful cannons. Those on board the planter were terrified. Quote, "When we drew near the fort, every man but Robert Smalls felt his knees giving way, and the women began crying and praying," stated one of the crew members. As the planter approached the fort, Smalls, wearing the captain's Panama hat, pulled the whistle cord, offering 2 long blows and 1 short one. It was the Confederate signal required to pass, which Smalls knew from earlier trips as a member of the planter's crew.
Yep.
In response, the sentinel on the fort's wall reported that the guard boat was going out. He didn't know that the guard boat was out of commission, and he had mistaken the planter for the guard boat. The sentry yelled at the planter, quote, "Blow the Yankees to hell." Smalls must have longed to respond with something hostile, but he stayed in character and simply replied, "Aye, aye." After clearing Fort Sumter, the planter continued at its normal speed through the main ship channel. For half an hour, we expected to hear the boom of a big gun at any instant, and when we finally got out of range and realized we had actually escaped, there was more weeping and praying and singing of hallelujah songs, the crewmen recalled. It was a moment they would never forget. About this time, back in Charleston, Captain Aurelia arrived at the harbor and discovered that the planter was missing. Rather than sound an alert, he set about asking questions anyone who might have seen the ship. Now, had he alerted the guards immediately, they might have been able to signal the forts in the harbor. Of course, many questions were asked of many people in the investigation to come later.
Oh, I bet. Why were all 3 of you at home?
Once the planter was out of range of Fort Sumter's guns, Small again ordered more steam and headed for the Union fleet. When the planter did not turn east toward Morris Island, the guards at Fort Sumter suddenly realized that she was headed for the Union vessels stationed off of Charleston Bar. The sentries tried to signal the troops at Morris Island, but by the time they did, the planter was too far away to be stopped.
Now, Smalls and the others faced the heavily armed Union warships patrolling outside of Charleston Harbor. The group's freedom was within reach, but they had to let the Union know that they were friendly before the Northerners mistook the planter for enemy warship and started firing.
Basically, you're on a Confederate ship,
exactly.
Headed right to the enemy.
With steam and smoke belching from her stacks and her paddle wheel churning the water, the steamer headed straight towards the closest Union ship. The crew rushed to take down the Confederate and South Carolina flags and hoisted white bed sheets as a sign of surrender. The Union fleet, here's the thing. The Union fleet were very wary of ships coming out of Charleston.
Right.
Recently, ironclad Confederate ships had attempted to ram the sides of Union ships. The Union knew that ironclads were being built in Charleston, and as the planter headed toward the Union fleet, a heavy fog rolled in.
Oh, no.
Yeah. This would make it difficult for the white flag to be seen, and even if they were seen, there was no guarantee that it would be believed. The planter began approaching a 3-masted Union clipper ship called the Onward. With wooden sides, the captain was quite wary of the danger of being rammed by an ironclad. Its young captain, John Nichols of Maine, decided that if there was any chance the fast-approaching vessel intended to ram his ship, his only option would be to destroy it first. He ordered his men to their battle stations.
Yikes.
Smalls and his crew saw the Onward's guns being prepared. They were frantically looking for a way to signal the Union ship. Nichols was about to give the command to fire when he saw the white flags. He immediately ordered his gun crews to stand down. The ships were now within hailing distance. Nichols yelled for the planter to come along its side. Smalls then spoke to Nichols. Quote, "Good morning, sir. I've brought you some of the old United States guns, sir. They were for Fort Sumter, sir." The men and women aboard the planter began jumping, dancing, and shouting in celebration. All 16 were free from slavery for the first time in their lives.
Oh,
wow.
My goodness.
What a moment.
That's amazing.
What a moment.
Nichols soon boarded the planter. The group of newly freed men immediately surrounded him and asked if he had an American flag he could spare. As the new flag was raised over the planter, the men and the women began shouting with happiness.
Kind of emotional.
Yeah, for sure.
Hannah held Robert Jr. over her head and told him to look at the flag. "It'll do you good," she said. Smalls also turned over to Nichols a secret Confederate code book detailing flag signal messages. Nichols was shocked as he realized what Small and his crew had achieved and just how much their act would benefit the Union.
Oh, for sure. He just handed over basically
a ship and 4 cannons and many more guns.
A cryptographic service right there. I mean,
taken from the Confederate and added to the Union.
Added to the Union. It was very valuable assets.
Well, back in Charleston, the citizens awoke to the embarrassing reality that the platter had been taken by a group of slaves. At first, people simply didn't believe it possible. It wasn't until the telescope spotted the platter lying between Union ships that all doubt was dispelled. Still, many believed that some white person must have aided in the plan. Suspicion fell on the 3 officers who had left the ship overnight. Word of the incident reached all the way to Robert E. Lee, who ordered that the officers to be punished. Meanwhile, Smalls and the rest of the escapees on the platter were escorted by a Union steamship to the Union headquarters in, of all places, Beaufort, South Carolina,
of course.
Smalls' birthplace. Commander DuPont was informed about Smalls' amazing deed. Quote, "I must meet this hero," DuPont exclaimed. Just hours after making his escape, Smalls was meeting with the man in charge of the entire South Atlantic blockading squadron and telling his story. DuPont was so impressed with Smalls that in his dispatch to the Secretary of the Navy, he wrote, quote, "This man, Robert Smalls, is of superior intelligence. His information has been most interesting and portions of it of utmost importance. I shall like to continue to employ him as a pilot on board the platter for inland waters." The chance to pilot the platter for the Union Navy was a tremendous honor for Smalls and one that he would gladly accept. Robert Smalls' heroic actions were soon published in newspapers across both North and South. The South lamented Smalls' bold feat, but the North celebrated it. The New York Tribune cited Smalls and his crew as evidence for creating a black military regiment. Other newspapers promoted the idea that Smalls and the other crewmen should be compensated monetarily for their daring act. In fact, this did occur. Smalls received enough compensation money to purchase the elegant white frame house shaded by giant oak trees on Prince Street in Beaufort, South Carolina, which contained the slave quarters where he had been born.
That's amazing that he was born there and that he would be owner of that house.
Right.
Well, we don't have a lot of time here on the podcast to go into all of the additional rich details about Robert Smalls' life because he did so many other things.
Right.
For the remainder of the Civil War, he bravely piloted the planter for the Union Navy. On 2 occasions, he was sent to the northern cities to give speeches and raise funds to help provide for the needs of the former slaves in Beaufort. In Washington, D.C., Smalls met President Lincoln and several members of the cabinet. He made a positive impression everywhere he went, and his speeches were always well received. After the Civil War ended and South Carolina was readmitted to the Union, Smalls was 5 times elected as a United States congressman. He continued working for the benefit of the former enslaved people. The difficult years of Reconstruction and then the Jim Crow era unfortunately did not generally result in much improvement for the black population of the South, but the bravery of Robert Smalls and the crew of the planter in their quest for freedom continues to be a source of pride and inspiration today, some 160 years later. Once again, we'd like to thank Kate Lineberry for granting us permission to quote from her just wonderful book, Be Free or Die, which is available on Amazon. There's a talk of a movie being made from this book, but don't wait for the movie.
Don't wait.
Read the book.
Read the book.
So good. Yeah.
Buy the book now and get the full inspiring story about Robert Smalls. We've only scratched the surface here.
That's right. There's many more details I wanted to be able to add in, but we would go on forever.
and because of the topic today, we don't have a trivia challenge. So,
just checking. Hey, thanks for spending this time with us. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Remnant 2 Podcast. You can also send us an email to say hi or to suggest a topic for our future episodes at staycurious@remnants2.com. We'd love to hear from you.
Remnant Stew is a part of Rook and Raven Ventures and is created by me, Leah Lamp, Dr. Stephen Meeker and I research, write, and host each episode, along with commentary by our audio producer, Philip Sinquefield.
Sometimes.
Special thanks goes out to the rest of our team, Brandy Nichols, Judy, Meeker, and Harbin Gould.
Now, before you go, please hit the follow button so you won't miss an episode. Head on over to Apple Music and leave us a review. We love reading those reviews.
Yes, we do.
Share Remnant Stew with your friends, your family, and that guy down the street who loves to do those Civil War reenactments. Until next time, remember to choose to be kind.
And always stay curious.